Hi, welcome back to the second half of History 3375, the CIA and the Third World. We left off doing a comparison of how well European intelligence organizations were functioning, given the fact that American intelligence operatives often considered Europeans to be their superiors in terms of the length of experience and their abilities. We looked at the British and the experience of Sidney Riley with MI6 operating in the Soviet Union and found that, well, as with American intelligence operations, British intelligence operations had their own human flaws. Sidney Riley was typical of people who were so committed ideologically, so opposed in this case to the Bolsheviks, that he couldn't see clearly in terms of evaluating correctly the possibilities of success of overthrowing the Bolsheviks, and his unfounded trust in the organization called the Trust, this group of Russian exiles that was in fact controlled by Bolshevik intelligence. And this becomes a common problem not only for the Europeans, Americans, but all intelligence organizations, is that if agents are motivated by strong ideological conviction, very often it's difficult for them to make clear and objective evaluations of what they're doing and what is the most successful tactic to be employed. Now, we want to look at the other well-known behemoth of intelligence activity before the creation of the CIA, and that was, of course, Soviet intelligence. And if we look back at the slide here, I talk about specifically probably one of the most successful intelligence agents, if not the most successful, of the 20th century, a man named Richard Sorge. Sorge was born in Germany, although he was of Russian descent, and after he received his university education, he became a foreign correspondent in Germany, operating out of Germany, and presented himself as a pro-Nazi. In fact, he was working for Soviet intelligence, and he used this front as his way of penetrating the Nazi regime. His most successful operation is when he went to Japan, the close ally of Nazi Germany, and was able to set up a spy network consisting of a group of Japanese who had ties to the imperial government, and was able to secure information from them about, of course, both the Japanese but also German intentions, and was also able to secure information from his friendship with the German ambassador to Japan. So he was able to use both the Japanese spy network and his close association with the German ambassador in Tokyo to secure information about what the Nazis were doing. Most importantly, he was able to secure information about Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had signed a non-aggression pact, but of course both countries knew that at some point they were going to go to war. What Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union, didn't know was when that was going to happen. Sorge was able to tell him down to the month and almost the exact day when that invasion would come. Stalin refused to believe him. In fact, he refused to believe other sources of information that told him the same thing, for a variety of reasons. One of them being his own ideological bent. He firmly believed that ultimately the real combat would be between the Nazis and the West. However, he also believed that the Allies, the Western Allies, were actually working on the side of Nazi Germany to destroy the Soviet Union. So he believed that when he was told by his intelligence sources that Nazi Germany is going to invade, that it was a trick by Westerners to try to get him to attack Germany first and to see Germany and the Soviet Union destroy each other. So because of his strong belief that Westerners as capitalists had to be trying to destroy him and the Soviet Union, he refused to believe the intelligence information that he was getting. Sorge was brilliant as a spy. His problem was the ideological orientation of his leader meant that his information was not properly used. it's a common problem we will see again. It occurs in the United States as well, that if you don't want to listen to what the CIA is telling you, you don't. It doesn't fit with your world vision or your perception of how things are working. Even directors of Central Intelligence, as we will see, have rejected the information given to them by their own analysts because it didn't fit their ideological preconception about what was going on. Sorge was eventually captured and executed in Japan, but in the meantime, he'd given invaluable information to Stalin about the invasion, but information that was never properly used. The Soviet Union was unprepared for the invasion because Stalin was convinced all of this information was just part of a Western conspiracy to destroy him by triggering a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, one other important spy and another highly successful spy that we want to talk about briefly in terms of European intelligence involves, again, British intelligence and specifically MI6. If we look at the bottom of this slide again, the name Kim Philby. Kim Philby was a British citizen. His father had been a British colonial bureaucrat, worked in the Middle East. While at university in England, Philby became a member of the Communist Party and agreed to work for Soviet intelligence. After he graduated from university, he became, like Sorge, a foreign correspondent and went to Spain, where he wrote very favorable reports about the war in Spain on behalf of the Franco government, the conservative government that was being supported by Nazi Germany. In other words, he presented himself as a very conservative correspondent and therefore helped eliminate suspicions about himself. You know, what his political orientations may be, he tried to make it clear that he was very conservative, when in fact he was spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. He was soon recruited into MI6 and began rising through the ranks during World War II. By the end of World War II, many people expected that within a few years, Kim Philby would be named the head of MI6. In other words, a Soviet intelligence agent was likely to become the head of British intelligence. But before that appointment would ever come, he was first given another significant job. He was to become MI6's liaison in the United States to work closely with the people who were then creating a new intelligence organization in 1947 called the CIA. Posted to Washington, Kim Philby worked closely with a man named James Angleton. Angleton was one of the former OSS, we'll talk about the OSS in a minute, former OSS officers who were helping to create the CIA in 1947 and 1948, and he and Philby spent many hours together at a bar, knocking down scotches and talking about intelligence work, etc. And Philby was able to play a significant role in the early days of the creation of the CIA. Eventually, Philby would be exposed as a Soviet agent. Some 8-9 years after this, although he would never be put on trial. One of the problems of trying a spy is you're going to have to reveal some secrets to prove that he was a counter-spy. But Angleton would never forget the betrayal by Philby. And as we will see, it will affect the course of the history of the CIA, that Angleton himself never recovers from this and maintains this deep-seated suspicion of even his closest friends in the CIA itself. But here, we are talking about a highly successful case of a spy, but we also see that it will have a detrimental effect ultimately on the CIA itself. Now, one other area that we want to talk about in terms of comparing what the US is doing at this time, and we see that the Europeans have their own successes and failures. They have the same problems, the fallibility of agents. But one area where they were excelling along with the Americans was in cryptography. A new age was dawning after World War I in this field, the field of making and breaking of codes. machine codes were now possible. A machine could make a code. One of the first and most important inventions in this area was the work of a Polish engineer named Richard Sorge. It was 1919, the war was over, Poland's economy was in disastrous shape, and Sorge was looking for a way to make a living. And he designed a machine to make codes with the idea that he would be able to sell it to businesses. Companies that bought and sold products internationally were always desperate to be transmitting information securely. What's the price of wheat in Argentina? What's the price of gold in South Africa? We need the latest quotes, but we want to protect them from our competitors. Well, here's a machine that will make a code for you. It looks much like a typewriter. You can go to the Museum of American History. They'll show you a sample of this machine. It has a series of dials across the top, usually 4. You can type in your message. It'll go through the machine and come out in code. To change the code, just readjust the dials. There are 4 dials. Change the setting on each dial, or just one dial, you'll get a new code. Change them again, you'll get another code. In other words, like that, you can develop a new code and immediately start using it. So you can imagine it's hopeless for human code breakers to sit there and say, well, you know, we'll spend a few days or weeks breaking this code. Great. By the time you break that one, they've already used 12 others because they're using the machine and changing the code constantly. So this would be an enormous advance. All that you had to do in using this and transmitting this message was to give the settings of the dials at the head of the message. You know, the settings are 4, 8, 7, 2. When I get the message in code, I set my machine, type in the coded message, and it comes out decoded. So all I need is those 4 dial settings to decode what you've given me. And we can, every day, send me a new code, that's fine. All I need is that 4-digit setting at the top. I'll set my machine the same as yours, type in the coded version, and it'll come out in the decoded version. For whatever reasons, it never took off commercially at this time. But the German military began using these machines. And they became the central focus for the transmission of coded messages by the German military during World War II. Now, the British managed to get their hands on a version of this machine given to them by Polish military officers, and the Polish military was also using it. Now, this didn't mean automatically, just because you have a version of the machine, that you have the exact same version as the Germans. The Germans used more wheels than theirs, etc. So you have to begin with this machine, but then you're going to have to do a whole series of elaborate calculations to try to determine what is the precise makeup of the German machine and what are the settings that are being used. At Bletchley Park, a manor house outside London, and you'll see that listed here, a group of British code breakers are busy at work right from the beginning of the outbreak of World War II, breaking these codes. Some of the greatest mathematical minds in the West were working on this and developing what turned out to be early versions of computers in order to solve this puzzle, how to determine exactly how the machine in Germany is put together so that they can break the codes. They have a sample, but they don't have the exact same machine. This machine ultimately was given the name the Enigma. And information that was secured once the British could break the code was simply known as the ultra source. In other words, if you were told as a military commander, well, we know the Germans are going to attack at this time, and you want to know, well, how reliable is the information? They don't tell you, well, we got it from this machine. They simply say it's from the ultra source. Only a handful of people in England knew that it was coming from this machine. Why? Because, of course, if this got around and the Germans found out, well, as soon as they knew that the machine's integrity had been compromised, they'd invent something new or just get rid of it. So the British are able, throughout the war, to break the codes the Germans are using for their military communications. Now, when this was revealed, and it wasn't revealed until 30 years after the war, people immediately asked, well, if you knew this almost from the beginning of the war, how in God's name could it take you so long to win the war? You knew what the Germans are going to do, right? You had to be stupid if you couldn't defeat them. And here on the next slide, we're going to look at, okay, even if you have this machine, even if your intelligence is this good, and it's hardly ever this good, that you can tap right into the codes that the enemy is using, even with that, there are serious limitations on using this information. First, a rare but factual occurrence, too much information. You get tons of messages being sent through this coded system. And most of them aren't worth squat for intelligence purposes. Some guy ordering beer for his regiment. Somebody ordering clothes. Tons and tons of messages that are just junk. So one of the problems is you have to sort that information out. Same thing happens today for the National Security Agency and the CIA. They can tap into a phone conversation in Moscow, Istanbul. Somebody's on their cell phone. They can direct, a cruise missile to hit you while you're talking on your cell phone. But with that huge influx of information, if you've got millions of messages flowing in every day that you're tapping from satellite communications, etc., how much of it can you analyze? You have to be able to try to boil it down to get to the messages that are the most important. That's why the CIA, the NSA, more specifically the NSA, National Security Agency, has supercomputers that they've been using for years to identify key words and therefore try to hone in, and even then you've got a mass of information, but to hone in what are the most important messages that we need to actually decode completely to find out what's going on. So there can be the problem of too much information, and that was certainly true with the Enigma machine. There was a lot of stuff coming across from the Enigma machines that was just junk or just irrelevant. On the other side, there's not enough information. Which sounds, whoa, wait a minute, this sounds stupid. You just said there was too much information. Too much junk information. At the same time, the fact is that only about 25% of German military communications were being sent through the Enigma source. Only 25% was being sent by radio transmission, specifically. In other words, if they're sending messages by telegraph across Europe or Northern Africa or other territories they occupy, well, the British can't access that. If they're sending messages by courier, Homer pigeon, which they use, you can't access that. The only stuff you can access is the stuff they transmit by radio. So you have to tap into the radio communications, but radio communications was responsible for only 25%. So you're only getting 25% of the military communications, and most of it's junk anyways. And the third problem is simply this. If you use this information consistently, every time you learn something significant, to counter what the British or what the Germans are doing, they're going to figure out what you're up to. If every time they launch an airstrike on Britain, you have your planes up in advance and are attacking them before they even get across the channel, the Germans are going to figure out something's going wrong with all of these operations. What do they have in common? And pretty soon they're going to figure out, in every one of these instances, we use radio communications and the Enigma code. That's where the problem is. So even when you have a golden opportunity to tap into the other side, you have to be careful how often you use it. The British actually allowed airstrikes to take place on their own cities that they could have prevented, because if they flew up every time to counterattack the Germans would catch on. So they had to allow some of their opportunities to pass them by so they could use only what they considered the most crucial information to counteract what the Germans were doing. All of these limitations affect even the best of intelligence sources. But the one that most commonly faces intelligence operations, as we'll see, is you never have enough good information. No matter what is presented, no matter how often the CIA or NSA are made to look like geniuses, like they know everything, the fact is, as we now know with the case of Iraq, very often the information is sketchy. That is a constant problem with intelligence gathering and analysis. Now, getting back to the Americans and back to this process of the development of American intelligence, we want to talk about the developments during World War II because these are critical. These mark really a turning point for U.S. intelligence operations. One thing about U.S. intelligence at the beginning of World War II, and even before the war began, was that Franklin Roosevelt was anxious to keep a decentralized set of intelligence activities going on. In other words, he was not anxious to create one dominant intelligence institution. We have Army intelligence, Navy intelligence. He has people who work with him as intelligence information gatherers. But he never wants to pull all of this together and create, shall we say, an intelligence czar who would be responsible for all aspects of U.S. intelligence because he prefers having room to maneuver. Only he knows everything that's going on because these other people are all gathering information for him, pieces of the puzzle, but he's the one that controls it. Unfortunately, for reasons beyond Roosevelt, this is going to be an ongoing problem for the United States in the second half of the 20th century, that there never is created that intelligence czar. Even after 9/11, when that was one of the first recommendations, that we have to have somebody that has overall charge, is over the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, everybody. Hasn't happened, probably never will, for reasons other than Roosevelt. But Roosevelt sets that precedent of having a series of intelligence groups and no single individual with complete control over intelligence operations. Now, another thing that comes up about Roosevelt, which is similar to the question of the Enigma machine, is the fact that, well, gee, if the Signal Corps had broken the Purple Code and you people were getting all this information about communications by the Japanese, why in God's name were they able to attack Pearl Harbor? And there have been books written speculating, well, Roosevelt knew it was coming. He allowed it to happen because so many people in the United States were opposed to war that he felt by allowing the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor, that, of course, would then be a situation where no one could resist the call to war. That is not only mere speculation, but it's really not supported by the facts. The problem is, yeah, they were gathering a lot of information, but just like with the Enigma machine, they got tons and tons of information, but what parts of it are relevant? And even when you decode a message, you know, the messages don't say, we're going to attack Pearl Harbor on the 19th. They don't even say Pearl Harbor, okay? Acronyms are used, code names are used, so you never have that information. You never get, you know, you never open the secret document and have it say, this is the day we're going to attack you and this is how we're going to do it. It's always fragmented. It's always allusions to code names that you don't know the meaning of. Even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and if you've seen the movie, you know, about Wake Island and how the Americans have to try to find out where the Japanese fleet is, and they arrange to transmit a message they know the Japanese will intercept, saying that there are problems with the desalination plant on Wake Island. That way, when the Japanese transmit that information and they use the code name for Wake Island, they will know if indeed the Japanese have been talking about Wake Island. When they say, oh, there's problems at X with the water desalination plant, the U.S. will know, okay, the code name for Wake Island was X. Oh, Midway, I'm saying Wake, Midway Island. We know that the code name for Midway Island is X. So when we read that in their messages, we know that indeed they're headed for Midway. That was the only way, even then, even after the original attack at Pearl Harbor, that they could break down some of these code names and find out what they meant. Your information is never good enough. And as they point out, after the war, yeah, Navy analysts had a chance to go through the messages and having hindsight, 20/20 hindsight, they could say, oh, that's what the Japanese were talking about when they said this, and when they ordered the fleet to move over here, that's what they were doing. And again, even though cryptography is great, they're breaking codes, it does not mean that they had the kind of information that would allow them to forecast what finally happened. These are problems we see throughout the intelligence process. They're as relevant today as they were 60, 70 years ago. And when we get to the end of all of this, when we talk about the Age of Terror, we'll see these same issues come back. Now, one thing that marks the Roosevelt administration off is that for the first time, there is going to be created a central civilian intelligence agency. And the person who will be responsible for that is the person that I've got listed here on the slide, William Donovan. William Donovan had flown in World War I for the US, come back as a war hero, become a wealthy corporate lawyer in New York, but retained a fascination with intelligence activities. He loved to dabble in these things, and he was a close friend of Roosevelt. And he works very hard to try to get Roosevelt to set up some kind of civilian intelligence organization with the idea, of course, that he would run it. He's assisted in this by MI6. MI6 is concerned, as is the British government, that the US will not offer support to Britain as it fights off Nazi Germany. This is a time, the war breaks out in Europe in 1939, but the US won't join the war till basically 2 years later, till the attack on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, the British are looking to the Americans to help them as they find themselves really the only major opposition to Germany in Europe. One of their major problems is that the US ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president of the United States, Joseph Kennedy believes that the British are washed up, that they're going to lose to the Germans, and the Americans might as well start making their peace with the Germans now. So the British government and MI6 are desperate to try to convince the Americans that in fact they can survive and are worthy of aid. MI6 approaches William Donovan, invites him to visit England and to see what they are doing in terms of intelligence. And he gets approval from Roosevelt to do this with the idea that, well, this will provide us some great ideas for our own intelligence activities. While Donovan is visiting London, his MI6 handlers take him out to Bletchley Park and they show him the Enigma machine, something only half a dozen people in the British government even know about. And William Donovan, this American civilian, is shown what's going on. Why? To say, look it, we can break every one of their military messages. That's how good we are. We have the technology. We have radar, which they were developing at this time. We're far advanced of what the Germans can do. So even though our numbers are small compared to the German military machine, our genius, our efficiency, our ability to break their codes gives us a real chance for survival. And indeed, Donovan went back and purveyed that message to Roosevelt. Was that the decisive factor? Probably not, but it's important for the British. It's also important for Donovan because it becomes the launching pad for his own career in intelligence. Once the US joins the war, Roosevelt will create the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS becomes the first central civilian intelligence agency, and William Donovan is named the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And the OSS is, in fact, the precursor of the CIA. If you want to know the institution upon which the CIA was based, the one that was modeled after, it's the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. Now, when we look at this next slide, we're going to see that the major functions of the Office of Strategic Services were quite similar to what the CIA does, quite similar to what other modern intelligence services elsewhere in the world do. They had four major areas of operation, function. Although there are others, this is boiling it down to the basics. First of all, special operations. Special operations were operations designed to assist resistance forces in Europe, Germany, Holland, and elsewhere in what was modern-day Yugoslavia, in other words, the Balkans. Local citizens had taken up arms to fight against the German occupiers. And the OSS would airdrop their own personnel with supplies into these countries to assist the resistance forces in launching attacks, hit-and-run attacks, against the Germans. So that was special operations, a form of paramilitary operations, something the CIA is very familiar with. Comes out of this experience with the OSS. And the OSS operated in Burma as well and other places in Asia. The next one was secret intelligence. Secret intelligence was on-the-spot intelligence. In other words, it was some guy standing, on a hilltop above the harbor at Marseille, the French harbor on the Mediterranean, with a pair of binoculars, wearing a trench coat and hopefully something under it, spying on the Germans and saying, okay, look, there's 4 battleships and a cruiser in Marseille right now. They arrived at this date. It's that kind of immediate information. Okay? We got it on the spot. This is where the weapons are. This is where the planes are. This is how many bombs they have, etc. The next one, and again, CIA is quite accustomed to doing that kind of thing, providing that kind of on-the-spot intelligence. Third one was also a form of intelligence gathering. It was called research and analysis. But research and analysis is much broader. These were reports written about the overall situation, let us say, in Germany. What is Germany's military, or I should say, industrial capability of continuing the war for the next 3 years? In other words, how many industrial plants do they have? How many steel plants, etc.? How many of them are being damaged on a regular basis? What is the fuel supply in Germany like? Looking at a broad issue. CIA does that. They call them national intelligence estimates. One of the recent ones in 2002 was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. What are Iraq's capabilities? What do they have? What's their stockpile? What are their plans, etc.? We'll get to that. That's something we'll be looking closely at, is that report later on. But that's the kind of thing that the OSS was doing with research and analysis. And the last one was morale operations, which is simply psychological warfare. OSS people spent their time devising messages and forms of propaganda they could use to discourage the enemy's troops. They used to drop little leaflets, on Japanese troops that were occupying Pacific Islands, saying, go home, your wife is sleeping with a German officer or something. And a lot of these didn't have much effect. The major effect on the morale of troops is, do I have enough food? Okay, am I dry? And do I have enough ammunition to defend myself? And the other stuff, as people will tell you who have been involved in any really desperate combat situations, the last thing you're worried about is, what might be going on at home, quite frankly, because you just want to survive. And if you're not surviving very well, then you might surrender. But morale operations was psychological warfare. Try to discourage the troops for the other side, get them to surrender, and doing what literally they did in Iraq, dropping leaflets that said, look, this is a safe pass. If you show this to an American soldier, he won't shoot you, and you'll simply be taken prisoner, and you'll get out of the war. Those kinds of things were being done in morale operations. So these 4 areas of activity, as we will see, are very similar to what many of the activities that the CIA will carry on in later years. Now, the OSS is famous for its operations with resistance troops and the activities of its intelligence offices, but it has a split history, shall we say. There are those that are highly complimentary of the OSS and what it accomplished during the war, but there are many others that weren't too crazy about the OSS. There are critics that say, well, in helping the resistance, all you did was you get a lot of people killed, because anytime a resistance group attacked the Germans and assassinated a German officer or whatever, the Germans would turn around and shoot everybody in the village that the resistance fighters came from. So was that really helpful? But more importantly, the fact is that the OSS was not the most popular organization in Washington from the time of its inception, in 1941. Specifically, the OSS had a real difficult relationship with the FBI and with J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. The FBI had itself carried out significant intelligence activities over the years, and not just domestically. I mean, they were responsible for hunting down Nazi spies and, saboteurs in the United States, but they also worked overseas. In fact, in Latin America, the FBI was very active in sending agents to various Latin American countries, looking for Nazis, communists, whatever other subversives. So they were very active in the Western Hemisphere. The last thing that J. Edgar Hoover wanted to see was another intelligence organization that threatened to compete with what he was doing. So he was a sworn enemy from the beginning. In fact, the OSS, in its charter, was prohibited from carrying out any activities in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States itself, of course. And that was a specific demand of J. Edgar Hoover. So immediately we have this bureaucratic rivalry going on between the OSS and the FBI. In one time, Donovan thought he could solve this problem in a little escapade. If we go back to the slide here, you can see I'm talking about midnight at the Spanish embassy. What happened specifically in Washington at the Spanish embassy was that the OSS learned that the Spanish embassy had an important German code book in its safe. So they devised a black bag operation. In other words, a break-in operation, where OSS officers would go to the Spanish embassy, climb the fence, break in, open the safe, and take the information that they needed. Now, Donovan's justification was, I can do this because the Spanish embassy isn't in the Western Hemisphere. And legally, he was right, because embassy property is the national territory of the country that controls the embassy. In other words, if you step onto the property of the Russian embassy in Washington, you're on Russian national territory. Yeah. So his argument was, we're not in the United States, we're in Spain, talking to Madrid. So I can do this, legally I can do this, because we're excluded from North America, the Western Hemisphere, but we're not in the Western Hemisphere. Hoover, who got wind of what he was up to, didn't agree. And he tipped off the DC police, telling them it was going to be a break-in at the Spanish embassy. So as the OSS officers are scrambling over that fence, they hear sirens and approaching police vehicles, and they have to run for their lives so they don't get caught. So Hoover was sending another message to Bill Donovan, stay out of my territory. And Hoover was not the only problem that Donovan had. If we go back to the slide here, we're talking about George Strong and Army intelligence. Do we have the slide up? Okay, good. George Strong was the head of U.S. Army intelligence. And if J. Edgar Hoover didn't like Bill Donovan, George Strong hated him. He thought that Donovan was a big mouth, for one thing, that he talked too much, and that he was a danger, that he might reveal information. He also thought that Donovan's people, the members of the OSS, were a bunch of innocents, a bunch of college kids who didn't know what they were doing. And indeed, many of the people that Donovan recruited were graduates of Ivy League universities, particularly Yale, and they really didn't have any prior experience, either in intelligence or military affairs. And Strong absolutely refused to cooperate with the OSS. In fact, even though Donovan knew about the existence of the Enigma machine and the ultrasource, and even though MI6 was sharing that information with the U.S. military, Strong, as head of U.S. Army intelligence, would not share the information with Donovan. So even though Donovan had seen the machine and knew about it even before Strong did, the OSS would not have any kind of direct access to that information, because Strong thought that Donovan and his people were a bunch of, spoiled college kids who were going to get a lot of people killed. Again, we have bitter bureaucratic rivalries going on between the OSS and other established intelligence organizations in the federal government. This is setting a pattern. When the CIA is created, the same kinds of problems exist. In fact, when we get talking about 9/11 at the end of the course, we will find that one of the root problems identified with what happened on 9/11 was the fact that rivalry between the FBI and the CIA frustrated efforts to pursue the trails of terrorists. So this is not just, oh gee, that's kind of an interesting historical story. These are problems that have persisted down through the years. It's true of the OSS, true of the CIA, it was true in 1943, it was true in 1947, it's true today. Now, before the war ends, Franklin Roosevelt dies. And with him, of course, dies Donovan's and the OSS's greatest supporter within the federal government. Donovan had submitted a proposal to the president for the reformulation of the OSS after the war into another form of a central civilian intelligence agency. Franklin, J. Edgar Hoover got a hold of the information, and, well, Harry Truman is president. He distributes the information to columnists he knows around the country, who then write columns denouncing the proposal that what Donovan is really trying to create is some kind of SS, like the Nazis, secret police. And God knows we don't need secret police in the United States. Of course we didn't. We already had the FBI. But the idea is this is a threat. This is some kind of totalitarian plot. Hoover's going to get his way. The OSS will be dismantled at the end of the war by President Truman. But almost immediately, we go back to the slide one more time, it's replaced by another organization, more loosely organized, called the Central Intelligence Group, which would briefly exist in 1946. This has a brief history, and we're really not going to get into it, except it's important to know there is a transition from OSS to briefly what was called the Central Intelligence Group before we go to the next level and the next slide, and we come to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, the simple main reason why, even when Truman got rid of the OSS, that he briefly created the Central Intelligence Group and then in 1947 creates the Central Intelligence Agency, was that the United States had clearly become a world power that was involved in events in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere far more than it had ever been at the beginning of the 20th century. Therefore, the president needed intelligence information on a global basis. And the president had various sources of intelligence information, including the FBI, Army intelligence, and Navy intelligence, eventually Air Force intelligence, etc. The problem is, you get all these different groups. The State Department provides intelligence information, but all these different groups are feeding information in. But there's nobody to coordinate. What the president needs is some institution and some office that will gather the information from all these different sources and provide a coherent picture to the president. Depending upon the president, down through the decades, since 1947, the Director of Central Intelligence has met regularly with the president to give him a national security briefing. In other words, what's going on in the world this week? How are things in Iraq? How are things, in North Korea, etc.? And put all the pieces together. And that's how the CIA came to be created, was for that purpose, to coordinate information. What we will see is that's almost always been a secondary function, even though that was the primary reason the agency was created, was to serve as this coordinator of information. If we go back to the slide, we'll see in 1947, we have passed the National Security Act. The National Security Act of 1947 creates the next thing on the slide, which is called the National Security Council. The National Security Council is a group of advisors to the president. And it includes people like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, used to be called the Secretary of War, and a variety of other experts in the government on national security issues. And the purpose of the council is to provide the president advice on national security issues. What are we to do about the fact that it looks like the Soviet Union's creating its own nuclear capability? Now, how are we to respond to that, et cetera, et cetera. So this Council of Advisors, the National Security Council, will provide that kind of advice. Now, to get information to the National Security Council that's coherent, so they can advise the president coherently, they create what is called the Director of Central Intelligence. The Director of Central Intelligence is the person who is to gather all that information and create a coherent picture in the international situation. And to do that, he will have an organization called the Central Intelligence Agency. So the actual title of what we always call the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, his real title, his main title, is Director of Central Intelligence, to emphasize the idea that he was supposed to be gathering this information and not just managing an organization called the CIA. This was the purpose. From the beginning, that's the main function of the agency. When they're writing this up in the National Security Act, they tell you that's what the agency is to do. But they also threw in a proviso, the kind of thing that bureaucrats do. When you're creating a new agency, you don't know, you know mainly what you want it to do, but you never know what else it might be called on to do. So the other thing they said was, and to carry out those missions regarding national security that are assigned to it by the National Security Council. In other words, gather, coordinate intelligence information, and then do everything else we tell you to do. That everything else will prove to be far more important than what was intended as the central mission. So the main mission is go out and gather and coordinate intelligence information. Turns out the other stuff, which was not defined at the time, turns out to be far more important. If we go to the slide once more, just that last part, we see that the real issue for the agency becomes, is its main focus gathering and coordinating information, or is it running covert operations? Because that becomes the main other thing. And we will see that the main emphasis comes to focus on covert operations rather than the gathering intelligence. And what we will see as we trace the organization's development between now and throughout next week, what are the factors that push the agency into covert operations and away from what was designated as its main function, and that is gathering and coordinating information? What things pushed it in that direction? If we go to the next slide, one of the first things that caused this, if we bring that slide up, is the Cold War in Europe. After World War II ends, almost immediately, our ally in the war, the Soviet Union, comes to be perceived as our biggest enemy. In fact, in 1947 and 1948, US military leaders in Europe that were there as part of the occupying force, etc., were convinced that a Soviet invasion of Western Europe was imminent. In other words, we're not talking 5 years, we're not talking 1 year, we're talking sometime in the months ahead, we could face an invasion. That's how certain they were that conflict was coming with the Soviet Union. Even as that initial fear began to subside, the conviction was there that conflict with the Soviet Union was inevitable and was going to determine the future of our society and the rest of the world. How to deal with what the Soviets were doing. In a National Security Council memorandum, NSC 68, the US, the National Security Council, began formulating an answer. They were going to have to combat the Soviets with every means possible. Be militarily strong, economically strong, combat their economic development, and deal with them on a covert level. We have to consider things like psychological warfare, propaganda, etc. All of these things are possibilities that we have to consider and be capable of carrying out. Now the problem is, all right, that's what we're going to do, but who's going to do it? Who's going to bell the cat? Well, the State Department doesn't want to do stuff like covert operations because that would make them look bad. You know, we're diplomats. You know, we're supposed to be representing our country, you know, and negotiating treaties, but we don't spy on people, at least not most of the time. The military doesn't want to do it because our job is military intelligence. We have an intelligence function, but that is to determine how many troops and so forth. We don't carry out covert operations. Now, we don't carry out psychological warfare unless it's a time of war and there are combatants on the other side. This is not a war. It's not a hot war. We're not fighting anybody. So we don't do that stuff. And besides which, if you're a spy in peacetime as a military officer and then you get caught, they shoot you. So who's going to do it? Well, who but the new boy on the block? Okay? Nobody else wants this job. Let's give it to them. The CIA. So the CIA winds up taking on these covert activities because other agencies don't want to do them. And besides which, who's in the CIA? Where did these guys come from? Most of them came from the OSS. They're used to doing this stuff. Okay? They were carrying out propaganda and psychological warfare and all that stuff, covert activities during the war. So they know this stuff. So give it to them. So the OSS experience plays a part too. Justifies why the CIA would do it. Now, they're going to give it to them. But of course, everybody hates the CIA. The FBI hates the CIA. The military intelligence hates the CIA. The State Department doesn't really like the CIA. So we want to give you this important job, but we don't want you to control it. So what do? Well, if you look at the last part of that slide, this man's named Frank Wisner, and what's called the Office of Policy Coordination. The Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC, is created to carry out covert stuff. And Frank Wisner, who's a member of the CIA, an officer in the CIA, former OSS officer, is going to be in charge of the Office of Policy Coordination. And the Office of Policy Coordination is located in the CIA. Except that the director of the Office of Policy Coordination, Frank Wisner, even though he's a CIA officer, is appointed by and reports to not the Director of Central Intelligence, which would be logical since he's in charge of the CIA, but to the Secretary of State. In other words, yeah, we want you to do this job, and we are even creating this office, the OPC, to do it, do covert things. But we want to maintain a tight rein on what you're doing, so the Director of Central Intelligence, he's not even your direct boss. The Secretary of State is. And this would remain true until 1952. Only in 1952 would the OPC be incorporated fully into the CIA. It's staffed by CIA officers, okay? But its director reports to the Secretary of State. Yeah, the Director of Central Intelligence also knows what's going on, but he doesn't have the final say on what happens. So it's part of the CIA, but it's kind of not. But it is. But this is the push where so many of the agency's personnel become involved in covert operations. Now, what did the OPC do? If we go to the next slide, we'll see what the OPC did. The concern of the United States in Western Europe at this time, after the initial fear of a direct Soviet invasion subsides, or immediate Soviet invasion subsides, is the fear of a fifth column. What does that mean? Fifth column means people who are in the country but plan on betraying it to some foreign power. Specifically, the US believes that the communist parties in France and Italy, which were very large, very popular at the time, will someday take control of those governments and then open the doors and let the Soviets occupy Western Europe. That they'll betray their own countries once they have sufficient political power. So the OPC now launches a campaign to combat the growing influence of the communist parties in Western Europe, particularly in France and Italy. One thing they do, many of the labor unions in France, for example, are controlled by communists. So the CIA hires members of the Corsican mafia to come to metropolitan France and beat up union leaders. break up union meetings, etc. Just bash them in the head, dump them in the river, etc. So we're not going to let the communists, we're going to break up these communist-controlled unions. Second thing they do, the Christian Democratic Party in Italy is considered a mainstream political party and anti-communist. The Christian Democrats in Italy will get a vast infusion of funding from the CIA to help them win elections and keep the communists out of power. In fact, the CIA was a major funding source of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, what became the largest party in Italy, from the late 1940s all the way through the 1970s. For more than 30 years, one of the principal financial backers of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy was the CIA. So, another way of combating the communist menace. Another method was to go after the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies, the countries that were now controlled by communists loyal to the Soviet Union. One method was to set up resistance groups and spy groups in the Eastern European countries. And one place where they particularly were focused on this was in Poland. What the OPC, the CIA, did was to round up a number of Polish citizens who had fled Poland during World War II and were now living in West Germany or other parts of Western Europe, and train them as spies. And then parachute them back into Poland to serve as spies, and hopefully they would also bury weapons. They would acquire weapons. The CIA would help them get the weapons, and they would bury these weapons for a future time when resistance was sufficiently organized that they could have an armed uprising against the communist government of Poland. Periodically, a few of the top figures sent into Poland would be brought to West Berlin. Berlin was sort of the beehive of spying activity in Europe. The Americans, the British, the French, everybody had spies in West Berlin, and of course the Soviets were sending their spies to East Berlin so they could spy on each other. But periodically they would bring a few of these top people back from Poland for debriefing, and also to provide them with additional funds to keep up their work. And they paid them in gold ingots. You couldn't pay them in dollars, because if you showed up back in Poland and said, well, I got dollars to spend. Really? Where'd you get US dollars? So they were given gold. And things seemed to be going swimmingly until 1954, when they discovered that, in fact, all of the Polish refugees had been rounded up almost the minute their parachutes hit the ground and recruited as double agents by the Polish government, and had been, in fact, working for the Polish government ever since then. And the gold payments were really going to help ease the balance of payments problems of the Polish government during the early 1950s. So that didn't work. But it was an example of what was trying to be done by setting up spies and resistance organizations to combat communist control in the East and the threat of possible communist influence in the West. Now, if we go back to the screen, the slide, you'll see the next couple of things, what I call balloons over Budapest, and then Radio Free Europe. Another tactic undertaken by the CIA, and specifically OPC at this time, was propaganda. Problem was reaching Europeans on the other side of what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. In other words, how do we get to these people that are in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union? Methods early on were relatively crude. What they would do is print up millions of leaflets that would have denunciations of the communists, saying, you know, they're killing innocent Poles or Hungarians, etc. And to get the leaflets into Eastern Europe, they would stack them up and then tie them to weather balloons. The prevailing winds would carry the weather balloons eastward, and eventually when the weather balloons reached a sufficient altitude, the balloons would explode and the leaflets would come fluttering down. The problem is, of course, you don't know where they're going to come fluttering down. Probably a lot more of them wound up in Polish cow pastures than they did, landing in cities and getting read by people, but it was a beginning. A more sophisticated effort was Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe was a series of radio stations located in Western Europe that broadcast information, news, propaganda, jazz, other kinds of entertainment into Eastern Europe. And of course, in the native languages of the countries that they were transmitting to. It was allegedly the work of a private foundation. And in fact, in the United States, American viewers throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s would periodically see advertisements for Radio Free Europe, talking about how Radio Free Europe was doing this wonderful job of bringing the truth to millions of enslaved Europeans, under, the awful rule of communism, and asking for donations to continue the good work. In fact, they didn't need the donations because it was a CIA operation. But they needed to advertise for donations because if they didn't advertise and ask for donations, people would say, well, where'd you get the money? You can't be running this for free. So you have to be getting money somewhere, and if you don't have a fundraising campaign, then where's the money coming from? So they didn't really need the money. It was pretty much a break-even proposition between what it cost for the advertising and what they got in donations. But it was important to keep up the front. This is a front organization being run by the CIA, and to keep people from asking, well, where did it come from? They ran ads saying, okay, well, this is really the work of your donations and this private foundation. Now, if we go to the next slide, hopefully, the Cold War is also being run in Asia. CIA trains people in Asia to fight communism. One of the places we did this was Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And we're going to see this case very specifically later in the course when we look at Vietnam as a case of CIA intervention. But from the time that the French abandoned Vietnam in the mid-50s, the CIA became intimately involved trying to prop up the government in South Vietnam and trying to, at times, undermine the communist government of North Vietnam. The US was also interested in training resistance fighters to go into the People's Republic of China, or Communist China as we knew it, to set up guerrilla bands to fight the communist government there. So people were, again, exiles from China, were trained in guerrilla warfare by the CIA and then ferried by air over Chinese territory by a private airline called Air America. Air America, of course, was another CIA front organization. It was paid for by the CIA. But, of course, if its planes got shot down, they just say, well, some private company called Air America was flying these guys, who are armed to the teeth. This went on for a number of years of dropping these guys. The general result was simply this. They were usually dead from the time they hit the ground. Not because they had a hard landing, but because the Chinese communists, their militias were out, and they usually picked these people up very quickly, and the penalty for attempting to overthrow the government was the firing squad. So this effort is not very successful, but it continues for some time with the belief that indeed we could roll back the communist revolution in China. One other activity that the CIA got involved with was working with drug lords in Southeast Asia, particularly what was called the Golden Triangle, an area that encompasses particularly northern Burma and parts of Thailand. Why would we become involved with these people? Not because the CIA was directly dealing drugs, but because they were looking for sources of resistance fighters against communism. They were looking sources of intelligence work for intelligence information, and these people who operated along the Chinese border were a valuable source. So as a result, they were allowed essentially to function without a great deal of harassment from the CIA, and the CIA was anxious that local governments in Thailand and elsewhere not prosecute these drug dealers because they wanted to keep them as a source of information and support for their activities along the Chinese border. It's one of the early cases of the CIA getting involved with people who are drug traffickers because they want to use them for other purposes, but also tainting the CIA because of their activities. We're going to come to a much more recent case in Central America in the 1980s and see similarities there, where we become again involved with people who are drug traffickers and give them largely a free license to operate because we want to use them in certain covert operations that we're involved in. So an early precedent is set in the 1950s in Southeast Asia in dealing with these drug lords. Now, the CIA was going to have other problems in Asia. If we go to the next slide here, we'll see that war breaks out in Korea in 1950. North Korea, communist North Korea, invades South Korea, which is pro-US. Problem is, the CIA is lambasted at this time for two reasons. One, they never saw the invasion coming. This sounds vaguely like the 1990-91 when the CIA gets lambasted because it didn't warn us that Iraq was going to invade Kuwait. Yep, very similar. So the CIA gets pounded on that one. There was no advance warning. You didn't know anything. And then once the invasion starts, the CIA is unable to come up with a decent estimate or assessment of, well, look, it's mostly South Korean troops fighting the invasion. Can they hold on for a few weeks until we can get US troops there? There is no accurate assessment. The CIA really doesn't know. They don't know what's going on in Korea. So there is heavy criticism of the agency for its failure to predict the invasion and then for its failure to come up with an assessment of what might happen after the invasion begins. Another important fact about what happens in Korea in 1950 is President Truman's decision. When he learns early on a June morning that North Korea has invaded the South, he has to make a decision within a couple of days of what he's going to do. Otherwise, it's pretty clear the North Koreans are going to roll. So they don't have much time. His estimation of the situation is that this is the work of Joseph Stalin. And the reason he believes that is because he had the experience of World War II. He saw what Hitler did in these lightning invasions of other countries. And he, like so many of his generation, was convinced the reason this happened was because the Western European powers were weak. They failed to confront Hitler. Their policy of appeasement, which is the British policy, was the cause of all of this. If they had confronted Hitler immediately, that would have been the end of it. The source of the problem to begin with was this totalitarian dictator. And we have to act now. He assumed from his historical experience, he created an analogy. This is just like what happened in Europe in 1939. Only the truth was, it wasn't. Because Stalin did not provoke the war. North Korea did it on its own. Oh, he provided weapons to them. But he didn't want a war. The last thing he wanted was that kind of confrontation. Neither did the Chinese communists. They had enough problems. They had no desire to confront the US at this point militarily, and particularly not in Korea. But Truman acts upon an analogy. This is what happened before. It's just like, it's the same thing. He's not the only one. Intelligence analysts frequently make the same mistake. They work from historical analogy. This is what was going on before. We're going to get to the case again of Iraq. And already we have CIA analysts saying, look, we knew what Saddam was doing in the early 90s. We assumed he was doing the same thing. When we had some scanty evidence, we saw some signs, we assumed it was a major league weapons development program. Because that's what he was doing before. He must be doing it again. Analogies don't always work in intelligence. Truman has the same problem. He may have been right in what he did, but his assessment of why he was doing it was all wrong, because this was not a Soviet invasion, it was a North Korean invasion. Given the problems that Truman sees with the CIA as a result of the Korean invasion and the lack of forewarning, he decides the CIA needs to be reorganized. And to do that, and this will happen time and again when the CIA has problems, the president says, okay, it's all messed up, I'll appoint a new director of Central Intelligence. And if we see again the bottom of that slide, the man that he chooses is a military officer named Walter Bedell Smith, who was a close friend of Truman's, and Walter Bedell Smith is sent in to reorganize the CIA. To get it working, that it's seen as too disparate. It's all over the place, trying to do too many things. It needs a coherent organization, and Smith is given that job. Now, what is that reorganization? What Smith will do, on this slide we see it outlined, is create the modern structure of the CIA. You can look at various organizational charts of the CIA, and they'll run on for 10 pages. Okay? But if you want to know what's the core of the CIA today, as it has been since 1951, it's this. 3 pieces. 1, the Deputy Directorate for Plans, now more commonly called Deputy Directorate for Operations. This is the part of the CIA that does covert operations. Okay, so that's segment 1. These are the guys that overthrow governments and try to assassinate people and stuff like that. The second piece that Smith helped create, the Deputy Directorate for Intelligence. Fairly obvious. These are the people that are responsible for gathering and analyzing intelligence information. And as we will see, if we put this on organizational chart, would have the Director for Central Intelligence at the top, okay, and then would have 3 boxes under him, with lines connecting them. And it would be Deputy Directorate for Plans or Operations, Deputy Director for Intelligence, and those 2 would, as in other organizational charts, be the same size. But the reality is, over the years, through the 1950s and 60s and beyond, the operations part, in terms of personnel, funding, etc., would grow to be 2 and 3 times the size of the intelligence part. Okay, so the chart shows you the 2 main pieces. What it wouldn't show you was the far greater importance of the operations or plan side, the covert operations side, because that's where most of the money and personnel were going, more than was going into intelligence. The last piece is the Deputy Directorate for Administration. And these are basically the people that handle payroll, personnel matters, maintenance, that stuff. The people you don't care about, right? Right. They are the people that run the place, okay? The Deputy Directorate for Administration. The other 2, of course, the 2 key elements of covert operations and intelligence. Completing this picture, in 1952, the OPC was finally fully incorporated back into the CIA. No more appointment by the Secretary of State, no more reporting to the Secretary of State. Now you report directly to the Director of Central Intelligence, and OPC essentially disappears. It is incorporated directly into the Deputy Directorate for Operations. So OPC is gone in 1952, and we have left standing the CIA as we will all come to love and know it. Plans or operations, intelligence, and then administration over here, with the 2 key parts being plans or operations and intelligence. These are the 2 pieces we're going to look at most closely from here on in, and operations is the part that's doing all the things that we're going to talk about in terms of interventions. Now, that's the core. But other pieces have been added over time, and one other organizational piece is important to mention. We're going to talk about it more next time, but the part called Science and Technology. And there has been a Deputy Directorate for Science and Technology. Basically, the idea of science and technology is simply this. It's not to study science and technology. They're not gathering intelligence on the latest scientific discoveries. What they're doing is taking current science and technology and finding applications in intelligence work for those discoveries. For example, better listening devices. How can we spy on people's phone conversations or hear their conversations, from miles away and get accurate information from that? How can we use computers to tap into telecommunications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Okay? Their job is take the science and apply it to intelligence gathering particularly, but also to a degree to covert operations. Lastly, and this is not an organizational piece, this is simply a function that has developed in the agency even by 1952, is something called the contingency fund. Now, as we will see, CIA budget is secret. When Congress approves the CIA budget, they don't approve the CIA budget. They approve a budget that includes money for the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, etc. And hidden in there is the CIA budget. Why? Because we don't want the enemy to know how much we're spending on intelligence or where we're spending it. So Congress knows that, yeah, supposedly we're building 5,000 more barracks for Air Force personnel, but actually we're only building 2,000. Money for the other 3,000 is going to the CIA. And bits and pieces are scattered off in that way. So the budget as a whole is secret. But beyond that, the agency knows that in a given year, something will come up. For example, we'll talk about this next time in detail. Oh, we got to have a spy plane, and we need it soon. We don't want to have to go to Congress and say, well, we need more money this year. There's not enough money in the budget, so we have a contingency fund, money set aside. We're getting money, for example, income from Air America, because its expenses are all paid by us anyway. So anything that Air America earns, because it actually does carry commercial cargo, is profit. So we put that money into the CIA contingency fund, and then when we need to spend $30, $40, $50 million on an operation, we don't have to go to Congress. We just spend it. We've got it in that contingency fund. So the agency, by 1952, has taken on its modern form in terms of its organizational parts and in terms of things like the contingency fund that will help fuel and fund special operations that the agency will carry out. Next time, we'll look at the evolution of the modern agency, the influence of important directors of Central Intelligence, and the decline of the agency beginning in the 1970s. That we'll all cover next time. Thank you.